So let's just go ahead and move into some important terms then. Some of these terms you may not have heard before, some of them you may have. Some of you may be more active in the LGBT community than others. And so I tried to just come up with some terms that are specifically important to gay men. Some of these are slang terms. Some of these are pejorative terms. And so I don't give you these to offend. I actually give you these because you may hear these terms, depending on who you're working with. And so I want to introduce at least some basic terminology that's going to be helpful in working with gay men, being that there's probably 100 more terms that you could find that you're going to hear, that you're going to need to explore on your own and begin to sort of create a vocabulary in working with the gay male clients that you may be working with. So one of the terms that I'm assuming that most people have heard, especially at this point with taking one of these courses, is basically the acronym LGBT, and I include a plus at the end of that. And that's because sometimes it will include other letters like I, A, Q is another letter that you may see there. Now typically the LGBT means lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. With some assumption that you're going to understand those terms, and certainly there are other more advanced courses that are going to explain those terms more readily. We're focused on the G in the LGBT, which are basically the group of gay men that we're going to be working with. Just to let you know, there are some other terms such as I, which means intersexed, A, which means ally, and sometimes has been used to mean asexual, and Q, that has been used sometimes to either mean queer or questioning. Now, you may think when you hear the word queer, well, isn't that a pejorative term? And yes, and actually we find that sometimes our gay male elders will actually continue to find that to be an offensive or pejorative term, whereas many of our younger, our gay male youth may use the term queer as a way of taking back power from that. And so you may see the use of Q almost like an umbrella term. Instead of saying LGBTIAQ, you may just hear one of your clients say that they're part of the queer community. Another term that you may hear in working with gay men is the term drag. It's certainly part of the gay male culture. Not every aspect of the gay male culture, but it is certainly influenced by the gay male culture. It is certainly a dynamic that your gay male clients will know of. And you've probably at this point, with exposure to, even some of your basic TV shows may have heard the term drag, like drag queen. But basically what we're talking about is someone dressing in gender-identified form, meaning usually they're dressing in the opposite sex from their biological sex. And usually the intent is for performance, for entertainment, and it is not the same as the term transsexual, and sometimes it's not used in the same way that we may use the term transgender. Sometimes you'll even hear the term drag queen, which is typically a male that is dressing as a woman, once again usually for entertainment or performance reasons. Drag king being someone who's dressed in a masculine sort of garb, representing sort of hegemonic or hyper-masculinity. So in thinking about gender expression in our terms, you may hear the term butch. Butch tends to mean appearing or acting more traditionally male, masculine. And these could be stereotypes. Sometimes I've heard it used as a pejorative term, like this person is so butch. It's almost like they're not accepting of their feminine side. But many times I hear the term really to be more of a neutral or sometimes even positive reflection of someone who tends to be more masculine in the gay male community. You may hear the term femme or queen. Once again, here's a term that you'll hear used positively and negatively, sometimes used in a way of, in a pejorative manner, or sometimes used just in a sort of neutral, fun manner. And really that's talking about appearing or acting more traditionally feminine. A term you may not be familiar with is the term bear. And basically the bears are sometimes considered their own culture, sometimes considered a subgroup of gay men, and really their focus is on hegemonic masculinity, more of the overt sort of traditional masculinity, and there's a valuing of looking more masculine, acting more masculine, although if you're part of the bear community, you may actually find a lot of variation and openness to fluidity of gender expression. But there is certainly a valuing of more of the overt traditional masculine roles and being. And there are different types of bears that you may hear. I won't go into any great detail about this. This is a good area to do some exploration on your own. But you may hear someone refer to themselves as a grizzly bear, or a polar bear, panda, or a muscle bear. These are all different types and manifestations of different types of men who tend to like masculine men or consider themselves more masculine. And there's other zoomorphic labels such as cubs, otters, wolves, and all of these have different representations based sometimes on age. Body hair is part of bearishness and part of masculinity, and so levels of body hair can actually determine some of your labels as well. Largeness, girth of body size versus being thin can determine what label you're allowed to use in this sort of this subgroup of the gay male culture. One of the terms that also has come out of sort of the subgroup phenomenon, sort of these smaller groups of a larger gay male culture, is chub. A chub tends to be a larger gay man and generally in body size. He may or may not be a bear. He tends to basically represent more about his body weight than things like being hairy or being necessarily masculine. That brings up another term, which is the term chaser that you may hear, which is generally considered a gay man who chases chubs or bears. He's someone that's attracted to someone who's either larger or hairier or more masculine, however the definition is being used. And there's a lot of fluidity in how these terms are used. These are labels of self-identification, often used in ways to help the person create some foundation of their identity. Now, here's a term, and when it first was used, at least in my experience, it was very pejorative. And I heard it used mainly in the bear, sometimes in the chub community, but mainly in the bear community, and the term is twink. And it was used in a very negative fashion, almost like coming from the word Twinkie or something, that it's really has no nutritional value, it has no real substance. And there's been a lot of negative things associated with the term twink quite often. But now, more and more, once again, I see a lot of our youth in the gay male culture taking the term and actually making it something that is sexy and attractive and actually used pretty neutrally, often just as a descriptor. Just know that it can be used in a negative fashion, it may be used in a neutral fashion, and you may have to further assess how it's being used by the client. Another term that you may hear, and this is a subgroup that's been around for quite some time, I think we can see all the way back 60s, 70s, if not earlier, were leather men, men who tend to dress in leather. There were connections to motorcycle clubs. There tends to be a bit of hypermasculinity often associated. Sometimes there's some association to sadomasochism as far as sexual interests, but not necessarily. The strongest connection is to the thought of attractiveness and worth of men who tend to wear leather. You may hear the term daddy or poppy. There's a tendency to use either of those terms to mean older men who tend to date younger men, meaning they're sort of a daddy figure. But poppy has also been used many times to just refer to gay Latinos. So once again, you may have to have a dialogue about what these terms may mean specifically to the person. Those are the ways that I've actually heard them used quite often. As far as other people that can be a part of gay men's lives, you may hear the term Fruitfly Hag. Sometimes the term has been fag hag, almost a reclaiming of the word fag in a way so that it's taking the power back from the word fag. And in the bear community, a fruit fly or a hag is referred to often as a Goldilocks. And basically, this is usually a woman who's very important, very affirmative, and ally, often, of gay men. So these may be important people in gay men's lives. Another term that's really important to know, and this is a more general term in the LGBT community, is coming out. Now, this is probably a heard of term at this point. It's pretty well used, and maybe the whole phrase coming out of the closet, but it's been really shortened to just coming out. And it's really the process of identifying and acknowledging one's sexual orientation, and it really should be understood it's on a continuum. One end of that continuum is closeted, which is sort of being in the closet versus out of the closet. And it's keeping one's sexual orientation more of a secret. Once again, that's on a continuum of how closeted one can be. I will say this, is that there is certainly an idea and a notion that the more out you are, the more healthy you are. Sometimes there's a premium placed on being out versus being closeted. Some of that is associated with some of the complexity, some of the difficulty of having relationships with someone who is closeted. Some of that can be a bit about shaming someone who's in a place that is not as far as advanced in identity development as another. One of the things that we have to remember as therapists, and I'm going to show you kind of an example of how it fits on a continuum, is that these are all personal choices. How out one is and how closeted one is certainly is something we have to be mindful of and affirming in working with our gay male clients. And it is a process that has to happen over time. You may hear the term domestic partnership or civil union. For some relationships, that may be treated, at least symbolically, as equivalent to marriage. Certainly we see a movement right now politically that is making a lot of distinctions about domestic partnership and civil unions versus the general legal term marriage. Part of that is in most states they're not the same, and in many states you have no access to any of these sorts of opportunities and resources. There are a lot of benefits that come with marriage, if not on a state level, on a federal level, that you don't get in a domestic partnership or civil union. I bring that up now really because I want you to be hearing those. I want you to hear those terms. I want you to be mindful of those terms so that when you hear someone use the phrase domestic partnership, civil union, or marriage, that these may be very powerful symbolically about connections and commitments in relationships. Another term that's really important that you need to be mindful of, and this is more of a psychotherapeutic term. Certainly I've heard it more in the culture of psychology than I've heard it actually out in the gay male community. The term is gender neutral. And gender neutral things, words, verbiage is really about using non-discriminatory language to describe the community and relationships. And a good example of that, you'll have clients who come in, maybe they're not ready to trust you, maybe it's at the first intake, and they're not ready to openly divulge their sexual orientation. And they may say things like, instead of saying he, your gay male client may say they, or my partner, more neutral and non-specific terminology. And there can be a sign of respect when we're using also that non-discriminatory language when working with gay men. I often have a dialogue with the gay men that I work with. I may use a term like partner, and for one person that might be offensive. I've certainly had a client say, the word that I use is husband. I prefer husband because it has a very unique meaning for me. Whereas another client may say, I say boyfriend, and another may say, no, I say significant other. I think it's good to have a dialogue about what sort of language works for the individual client. Really, this gender neutrality is more about being mindful of the language that we use. We're going to talk a little bit later about sort of how we've developed a heteronormative and a heterosexist lens, and often the language we may use may reflect some of that. So really being mindful of more gender-neutral language helps us to be in the right place in working with gay men. Gender variant is a term that I'm hearing more and more often, and this is really about someone who's presenting gender traits that may not be normally associated with their biological sex, that they have some variance, and it may even reflect more than any sort of polar end, like being more feminine than masculine. It may actually represent fluidity in gender. Often when we're talking about gender, we need to make sure that we're making a distinction from gender from sexual orientation. Being a gay male doesn't determine whether you're masculine, feminine, or where you fall in that whole continuum, or how fluid you may be, because really we don't live in polar ends as far as our gender. We're often doing masculine and feminine things all the time, based on some of the stereotypes or the notions of what is masculine and feminine. Heterosexism is a term that we use when referring to the ism that's related to the bias against specifically here against the gay male population, but certainly against lesbians and gay men. And this is the notion that somehow being heterosexual is not only normal, but superior to any sort of alternative to being heterosexual. And so heterosexism is the notion that it is better, being heterosexual is better than being gay. And so other terms you may hear from that is heterosuperior, heteronormative. Those are the kind of terms that are reflective of heterosexism. And it's good to be mindful that we all have some of that within us. Once again, we'll talk a little bit about that more later on. Genderism is really as the ism when we're talking about treating gender with a little bit of rigidity, in the sense that men are supposed to act like men and women are supposed to act like women, whatever that may mean. And culture, the more dominant culture, will often define what that means. And so there's a sense that it is superior to act like your biological sex and avoid acting like the opposite sex. Once again, most people don't fall on polar ends as far as their gender expression. So we'll see a lot of genderism, much like, and it's akin to sexism, when we think that engaging in very, very gender normative ways are somehow better than variants to that. Homophobia, well-used term, probably have heard that. That term is really about a fear-based reaction to gay men and lesbians. And internalized homophobia is really, as far as gay men, this is where we internalize the shame of being different. We internalize the messages that are in relation to the phobia that we've experienced. It's almost like a self-fear, a self-loathing. And it can be really significantly repressed and re-expressed in ways that's detrimental to self and to the community. It's almost like the self-loathing can be redirected to others. So you'll see on one of the slides there's a slide that says important terms, the continuum, and this really talks a little bit about sexual orientation, gender identity, and the closet. Now here's my disclaimer about this. When you look at this, you're going to see that this sort of creates like polarity, as if people can fall just in the heterosexual, just in the bisexual, and just on the gay side of things, or just in masculine, just in androgyny, and just in feminine, and that is not its intention. It's sort of a bipolar spectrum here. It really is trying to give you an idea that there's this whole continuum that we all, no matter what our sexual orientation is, no matter what our gender expression or our gender identity may be, is we have this whole continuum of where we may fall at any given time, at any given moment. But it's really to take out a little bit, the reason I include this is to take out the notion that there are just 3 points: heterosexual, bisexual, and gay. Also with gender, there's more than just masculine and feminine or androgynous. There's a whole spectrum, and once again, at any given time, that can be very fluid and it can shift. Being in or out of the closet has a lot of variation, and there needs to be some degree of selectivity. There are reasons why people will tend to stay in the closet in certain areas and not in others. Now, I will say that much of our research does show that being more out tends to be connected to health, to wellness, to a sense of solid identity, a sense of self. But where you fall in that continuum is also part of the personal sort of choices and the personal components of how do you live in this world when there's a dominant community that may send a very negative message about how you express yourself as a gay man. One of the things I'm always mindful of is I don't ever push anyone out of the closet, and I certainly don't advocate that. I think from an affirmative practice, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that is in a later segment, we try to really be mindful of where the person is and really discover where things are not working and where things are working for the person. So I just want to make you mindful that these are all continuums. Once again, that they're not really polar endpoints or polar points where we just fall and stay. These are all very fluid at any given moment in any given situation.